Welcome, everyone, to another edition of 45 Forward, where our mission is to help you, our listeners from Los Angeles to Long Island, make your second half of life even better than the first. Today, on the fifth anniversary of my 45 Forward podcast, my guest is Dr. Andrea Gould Marks, a licensed psychologist, an entrepreneurial coach, podcaster, and seminar leader based in Arizona, who also happens to be my lifelong friend. We'll be talking about our collective experiences over the years promoting creative strategies through times of change, offering resources and guidance for people navigating life's crossroads, both personally and professionally. We'll share our respective evolutions to where we've come today. I with Royal Resources, writing about aging issues, to where I am now as a podcaster with 45 Forward, my mission helping people thrive with purpose and productivity through the second half of life. And Andrea, with a unique career as a therapist, creating lucid learning systems, co founding Boom Talk Media to inspire and nurture the human journey with insightful media as society undergoes the effects of rapid and often unrelenting change. We'll reflect on the importance of friendship, including our own, and social connection today, and the need for friendliness in a culture driven apart by political differences. And we'll talk about our thoughts and hopes for the coming year, as well as how we can plan, adapt, and succeed during a time of great uncertainty. So now let's meet my guest, Dr. Andrea Gould Marks. Andrea, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for inviting me, Ron. I look forward to it.
Yeah, thanks. Me too. Me too. So I thought for our listeners, we'd give a little bit of a review. So you've been on the show a couple times before. You were one of my first guests within the first month of the
So
show
flattering.
in 2021. Just right after the pandemic was, I guess it was sort of past the peak, but still kind of in that
Present.
basic time. And then we came back once again several months later. And so now I just wanted to talk to people about sort of, how we met. Do you remember how we met exactly?
I actually do. I actually do. It was funny too, because you being a journalist,
Mm-hmm.
and I think you were at that time, and you were collating and writing a newsletter for the Film Folio for
Mm.
Huntington Cinema Arts, which was called something else at that time.
Yeah. It was called the New Community Cinema then.
Correct. And you were working there and you were present there. And I was doing a workshop on journal keeping,
Mm.
which was one of the first topics that was fascinating to me, being someone who's kept a journal pretty much lifelong. And also that people really seem to enjoy having some guidance and direction around that. And of
Mm-hmm.
course, being a psychologist and being interested in the trajectory of people's lives, um, I thought this would be a great thing to do at the new community cinema,
Mm-hmm.
at the Cinema Arts. And I was right. And then I don't know if you came to the workshop, but you certainly expressed
Mm-hmm.
interest in the
Mm-hmm.
workshop. And
Mm-hmm.
that's how we became friends.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was just clear that we could see that life already as a journey. I had already been, through a few iterations on my way to going back to being a mainstream journalist, and I would keep going back and forth, and I still consider myself fundamentally a journalist, but there are different ways to do this, and there are different ways to connect with people, and we always connected over the idea of adapting to change, which people talk about, but it's always, as you know, much more difficult than we really admit.
Right, right. It's a phenomenon. And of course, keeping a journal in the first place, my interest in it was to review what had happened, my predictions, my dire predictions, the transient states that seemed to be also important. It really gave me and gave my students a real bird's eye view of how change actually in real time looks, because
Hmm.
in real time looks a whole lot different than theoretically. Right.
Yeah.
So theoretically, you go through different phases, etc. Something ends in your life, and then there's all these. attendant feelings that go on, of discouragement and disengagement and, disorientation, all of that. But up close, day by day, it's a highly uncomfortable state.
Right.
It's chaotic, and emotional,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes, depressing. Sometimes, of course, on the other end of it, very exciting, so far as you can even hardly contain your excitement. But when we picked up lives with one another, we were both in our, I believe, early 30s.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so that in itself was a time of really burgeoning change and really big sense of possibility,
Right.
as opposed to now in the second half of life, and even maybe in the second or third quarter,
Mm-hmm. Right.
in the season of autumn or winter of life.
Mm-hmm.
Everything seems so much more almost critical,
Yeah.
in terms of decision making, etc.
Right.
So I just offer that out.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that so at that time that was the I think the beginning of the recognition of the impact of change. I think that was the time of Alvin Toffler's, Future Shock,
Absolutely.
and then it just accelerates, and a lot of us now talk about like, oh my God, like time goes so much more quickly now in this part of life than when we were a kid, and I think there are lots of reasons for that.
Well,
Um,
the old toilet paper thing that the closer you get to the end, the faster it spins.
right, right,
And so
and
that's true,
right, and the more urgent it becomes.
right? And the more compressed.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know, I mean, there is that realization at the other end of the spectrum. And I don't know that we're at the end of that spectrum, but
Hmm.
we certainly can see the end because we are exposed to it all the time.
Yeah.
That, you know, the sense of meaning,
Mm-hmm.
sense of purpose, the whole specter of regret,
Mm-hmm.
becomes very real. And then what do you do with it?
Mm.
You can name it, and sometimes naming it helps, but naming it is only the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Dealing with it is another story.
Yeah, yeah. So we're going to talk about this quite a bit more, but before we go do that, I just wanted to, mention that we've been talking about these issues for quite some time. So one of the issues that, not of the issues, one of the notions that is important to me has been our friendship over a lifetime, and that's something that it's unusual. I mean, we don't. We were in Long Island, same basic place for quite a while, and then it was a big decision for you. You moved to Arizona, and so and friendship is an issue through life. You lose your friends, you move away, your friends pass on, they retire. Um, so the issue of how do you maintain friendship is something that's important. And what are some of the ways that you think about friendship over long distance or over time?
I think that, believing in friendship
Mm,
as one of the top factors in terms of life satisfaction. I
mm-hmm,
just believe it. I am a good friend, which means I generally stay in some kind of touch or I make myself available. Um, and I think it's really critical to health, especially as we get older.
right, right.
Then there's the basis of of friendship. Like, on what basis does it form?
Mm-hmm,
Just that we're next door neighbors? Is it just that we work together? Or in our case, we never worked together. We weren't neighbors. We didn't go to school together. We didn't have a foundation other than our experience of one another as being the kind of person with whom our soul resonated
mm-hmm,
or resonate.
mm-hmm.
That resonance is something that is really foundational.
Yeah,
It's not to be taken lightly. And so when it's there, it's like, okay, this is an important thing to pay attention to.
Hmm.
So I know that Ron is a serious thinker. He's a grounded thinker. He has an appreciation for creativity.
Hmm.
He's willing not to hold on to an old way of doing things, but open to innovation. And also thinking bigger than whatever the date was. So whatever the date was in January 1985, let's say.
Hmm.
Our thoughts, our aspirations were always bigger than January 13th, 1985,
Hmm.
or 86 or 87 going forward. So there was also, I think, what we shared, a sense of time, of respect for time being something that can change things and mold things. But there are certain things that are inviolate that don't necessarily change.
Hmm.
And those are the things that I find awesome
Hmm.
in friendship.
Yeah. I think there is a sense of soulfulness, that there is a core that of values and exploration that we value in each other, and that,
Yes.
when we talk, there's I always, get the sense you're thinking ahead, you're thinking about things, and you're, expanding, and that's to me really important, maintaining that curiosity in life, and that those inner values. And so you do have friends, and you do have work friends, and you have school friends, um, and then, but you realize that the basis of the friendship was just proximity. And it wasn't,
Convenient?
yeah, it wasn't false. It just was, that was the basis of it. You were in school together, so you were sharing some of those experiences, or
Raising children together.
raising children. Right. You're friends with their parents, but the basis of your connection is your kids. It's not you. And it's nothing, nothing wrong with that. It's just, it's a different kind of
Different.
relationship.
It's different. And I think that that's why, when we think about soul connections or we think about resonance, the dynamic nature, I think, of the dynamic nature of life and
Hmm.
all that goes along with it, that mini ever-changing nature that goes along with it. I fully expect that when I reconnect with you the next time, there will be myriad changes
Hmm.
that have gone on. And so the appreciation, I think, of the dynamic nature, like you don't expect the other person to be who they were exactly, but an evolution
Hmm.
of who you know them to be and who they might become,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. So you can maintain, long distance friendships and lifelong friendships, but then also inevitably things change, you moved. So that to me has always been a big issue. Yeah, my podcast 45 Forward, a lot of people in their 50s and 60s, well, decide they retire and they want to go to some place else, and another place. And that's a big change. So what did you go through? Well, I remember having some conversations with you about it, and it was hard. I mean, some of it, and then some of it had to do with your dad, who
Right.
you had to find a way to maintain connection with him, and then with Michael, But what were some of the thoughts as and anxieties as you changed locations to another part of the country?
Well, first of all, I always did enjoy visiting Arizona.
Okay.
And mostly, surprisingly, I love Arizona at night
Hmm.
because of the starriness of the sky
Mm-hmm.
and the quietness that exists here. There's a profound sense of quiet.
Mm.
Now, if I lived in the middle of the city of Tucson, maybe that wouldn't be so. If I lived
Right.
by the university, maybe that wouldn't be so. But I live a little bit off in the hills. And so the quiet is, and my appreciation for stillness
Hmm.
had a lot to do with my choosing it. But the most important thing is that I was able to reconnect with a man who was in my younger years, early 30s, most important to me. And
Mm-hmm.
though we couldn't really do relationship when we were in our 30s because we each had young children at the time.
Mm-hmm.
the time all of a sudden became right. The invitation stood. The location changed from, in our case, California and Montana
Hmm.
versus New York to Arizona versus New York. And I'm like, okay, JetBlue had a direct flight to Tucson.
Okay.
And so, and it was time. I felt it was time for me. And I had been feeling it. I don't know if you remember that, but I had been feeling that for a long time. Like I was living in a residential area where people are raising their children. I was
Mm-hmm.
no longer raising a child. I had curiosity about what it would be like to live in another place.
Mm-hmm.
I had my heart set on the Hudson Valley of New
Mm.
York, which is
Right.
my absolute favorite, except for the Berkshire Mountains of Massachusetts,
Mm-hmm.
one of my favorite places. So when Arizona came up as a possibility, I was like, hell yeah.
Mm.
You know, and I knew that my friends in New York or wherever they are, they're spread out now too. You
Mm-hmm.
get to a certain age, and some friends move south, some friends move west. Um, uh, but I did believe, like I said at the beginning, I do believe in friendship, and so we were fortunate enough to be living at a time where technology with a small t,
Mm-hmm.
like with a big T, like it's a major player
Right.
in your life. It's a major source of, either advantage or frustration.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But technology with a small t, the flights left LaGuardia or the flights left JFK and they were reliable and, they flew many places and, we had all that going for us.
Right.
And so it seemed, especially in terms of the most important thing, which was my people, my clients and my friends, they would still exist.
Mm-hmm.
The brick and mortar, not so. Now I do miss the trees very much.
Mm-hmm.
I miss the variability of the seasons very
Right.
much. And at the same time, I understand that there's no moving on without some sacrifice. And so the planes may fly again more reliably and you can find some greenery.
Yeah. You can find the greenery, and I think that's the possibility of our age, and the challenge is that it takes an effort, right? I mean, it's not um, because decades past, you didn't move around. I mean, the possibility of movement is exciting, but it inevitably also generates loss. I mean, you do lose somewhat of your roots. When you people, I do find it interesting that there's some people that I know now who have been in my town, Glen Cove, their whole life. And some people in their 80s and 90s now. That's a different kind of journey, and it's not that's perfectly valid. Nothing wrong with that at all. But many of us do move around a lot, and I think that because we're basically social beings, it presents a challenge. And I think it's no accident that one of the big problems today, right, is what they call this epidemic of loneliness.
Right, right, right. And that's why maybe people who are on the verge of that mobility, where, the parents are gone. Like I was fortunate that my now husband recognized that my dad was part of a package deal,
Mm-hmm.
getting me, but he was also getting my dad, and my dad was maybe 93 or 2 at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And um and my mom was passed.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that was, and I know your commitment to your mom, my commitment to my dad in the later years was again one of those non-negotiable
Right.
kind of things, so the willingness for him to come with me, the willingness for my sibling to part with him, the willingness to both of us agree that living here would be easier on him in the long run, in terms of not necessarily living in the city and having to, deal with all that at 92 with
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
So, one of the things that I liked about your approaches is that you always focused on tools, strategies to help people. And I noticed recently you posted something about, let's talk about your word for the year, potential.
My word for the year. Yes.
Yeah, yeah,
Yes.
and I think that that's yes, that's a very pregnant word. Lots of possibilities there, and you pack out some of the components: embracing growth, measurable goals, discipline. So talk about how you think about potential, especially it's a nice word, especially at our age when we're still thinking in those terms, and which I think is important. We're still thinking about possibility and
Yeah.
potential.
I have a little questionnaire that sometimes I give my clients, and it starts with words like, what remains undone?
Mm-hmm.
What remains unlearned? What remains yet to be? If I was to, have a year to live, what would I wish I had accomplished?
Mm-hmm.
Goals. For me, I have a very concrete goal. I really would like to get my work into another form other than some of the large loose leaves full of programs and possibilities that are on my shelf.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, I really stayed in sync with technology with a big T in terms of how can technology assist me as a psychologist in reaching more people?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what potential does the work have for reach? Now that technology is such as it is, what potential exists that's untapped? What potential exists that's untapped in me? So in 2015, when I chose to create a podcast, when not a lot of people knew what a podcast was, I always enjoyed public speaking. I enjoyed educating. And so combining that with what was available in terms of the progress that technology had made it like, okay, I don't need to do a radio program. I can just record it on my own. Just like self-publishing.
Mm-hmm.
Publishing three, I didn't have the patience to send books to a publisher, but I had to get it out.
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
wanted to get it out. So it's that back to that question, what remains unfinished?
Mm-hmm.
And whatever the equivalent of unfinished is like what area of potential needs to be explored in
Mm-hmm.
all of us.
Yeah. I guess the question also comes up with what remains unfinished is what do I need to finish and what is okay to remain unfinished.
Yeah, I know that's a question, what's okay to remain unfinished. Right now, still in my 70s, it feels like, whatever I can do in my 70s,
Mm-hmm.
um, I'm gonna do.
Right.
I'm not counting on myself to do those things in my 80s. And maybe I'll be surprised. I have no evidence to the contrary, but I don't want to overcommit
Mm-hmm.
myself to myself because I know how hard I can be on myself if I don't do what I set out to do.
Right.
So it gets dicey at this stage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does. So I just meant that, for myself, looking at things and realizing that, yeah, it does focus you, as you said. We don't, if we make it out of our 70s, that's great. I think, I feel like I will. Um, but it does focus you in terms of, well, what do I need to focus on? What do I want to focus on? Not necessarily what do I need to. What do I want to focus on? What do I want to contribute? And what things were, on the plate, but like, okay, not so important anymore. I can see, some separation from what I thought was important to what is now evolved. And but it's tough to let go of certain things. Like I have certain projects that I'm like, okay, there's, I'll just put them down at the bottom of the page. I don't want to
Right.
kick them off, and that's okay because I sometimes keeping them there
You know,
generates, like, oh, okay, I won't do that, but that will lead to something else, you know. So um, so that's what I'm going to focus on and think about, um, uh, you know. Uh, what really is essential to get done? What is it that I need to do that will contribute to my significance, um, that I didn't think about before, but it's that's what has emerged. So having
so
some,
what things might those be? I warned you that I had,
yes,
I might break out into a cough.
yes, I know we all, this is the sign of our times too, is that always, potential, well, especially winter, but it's, you know, so that's, so you're asking what would those things be?
Yes. What feels extraneous or which things are you questioning
Um,
about whether or not they're worth finishing? I'm just curious.
yeah, well, I think that there are certain book ideas I had, you know, that uh, that I, they're guides. They're different kinds of guides, or there are different cuts on aging that I want to write about. But realize that, okay, my journey with caregiving, as a particular aspect of aging, and in a way, connects a lot of aspects to aging. It connects the social aspects. It connects the sense of connectivity to people, our sense of obligation, our sense of generation, and it's like, okay, that may be enough of the aging exploration to really deepen and broaden as I get older. I don't need to look at all the aspects of aging. There are lots of people who are longevity experts, and they talk about the implications on society of jobs and all sorts of other things. And so that's what I mean. Like I can focus my interest in aging in a few areas. Um, Caregiving is one big area. The other area is what's referred to as age-friendly communities. Um, and you and I have talked about that, quite a bit. We'll talk about that in a minute because there are some things I want to explore with you that you've um, mentioned to me over the years. But then, so the notion that, yes, of a certain age, and certainly, um, there are specific issues as you get older, but I want to push the envelope in terms of, multi generational connection, because I feel that one of the problems in our society is our technological approach, which is one of specialization. And certainly we can get far in medicine and specializing, and science and specializing. Um, but life is essentially what I call ecological. It's about relationships across generations. So by focusing so much on seniors, you silo yourself, and you create generational differences when I prefer to look for the connections, the similarities.
I agree. I agree. And I have always been excited about intergenerational relationships. I think they're critically important. And I think that they are, to say they're important is an understatement. They are shaping forces for young people, and they are essential connections for self-esteem in people who are aging,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
all of us, because it's natural to want to feel like you've made a contribution.
Mm-hmm.
It's natural to feel like you want to give back.
Right.
These are some fundamental parallels of the aging process that make a real difference in terms of life satisfaction.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember my first job was at the A. Holly Patterson Home for the Aged
Oh,
and right. But I'm
interesting.
like 18 at that point.
Mm-hmm.
But what I got to see was the incredible joy. And I was a research assistant, so it
Mm-hmm.
wasn't like I was a nurse or a candy striper even. I was doing psychological research on a government contract, but I was visiting the residents who were in this facility who were appointed as subjects in this overall experiment. And this is such a good example of this was not factored in to
Mm-hmm.
the um, government contract because it was the effect of activity on life satisfaction and on activities of daily living of the residents in this place. You know, they were a
Mm-hmm.
captive audience. What didn't factor in was how much an influence my clipboard and my visits as a teenager, more or less, 18 years old,
Mm-hmm.
visiting in with these people who were aging and infirm.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the pleasure that it gave them, to sit and talk about their lives it was so essential to their
Mm-hmm.
sense of well-being. I was a contaminating factor,
Mm-hmm.
right? I was out of control, out of the control
Mm-hmm.
aspect, but they didn't factor it in. That was back in the time before they were saying, the experimenter has an effect on the
Right. Right.
experiment. Right. But intergenerational mentoring is one of the things that I am really passionate about.
Mm-hmm.
And I came up with this notion for an intergenerational mentoring matrix
Hmm.
as a structure that could fit in to any community.
How would
It's
that work? Yeah.
an element. Well, you take a community,
Mm-hmm.
whatever, wherever the community is. So if you talk about a geographical community, for instance, like Glen Cove,
Mm-hmm.
or a community as in a group that is cloistered around a particular church or educational system, and cut across the age groups.
Mm-hmm.
It could be artificially or naturally
Mm-hmm.
connected.
Yeah.
You take something like a craft group, um, and you'll find people, and this happened a lot during COVID, knitting, which used to be, for older people who had the time to sit and knit, as opposed to other activities. And then you had a whole bunch of young people crafting,
Mm-hmm.
crocheting, and at a much younger age because that was a factor. COVID was a factor in really connecting people with skills that weren't um, in their original idea of
Right.
what they were going to do with their time.
Yeah.
But the intergenerational mentoring matrix, as I see it, is made up of young people who really want to work with older people,
Mm-hmm.
or young people who would get identified by, guidance counselors or their religious institutions as people who, could really benefit from the presence of older people. Then you've got older people who really want to give back and really would be excited, but there's no structure for it.
Right.
You
Yeah.
know, I mean, there's the Boys and Girls Club, there's some volunteer organizations, but mentoring is such a psychological gift
Mm-hmm.
that flows in both directions.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it can happen organically, and I think in older communities where people generations did stay together, it happened more organically. I think it can happen just as much today, but I think it takes more effort because I think that
Yes,
we
it takes somebody to spearhead it.
right, because we've structured things in silos, and unfortunately, even in terms of programmatically, in terms of government programs, it's for seniors or for kids or and so the funding goes in these silos. So it makes you've got to really cut across and make an effort. But I think it certainly is worth it. And from my perspective, you know, my So my caregiving navigator was designed essentially for caring for people as they got older, your parents or your relatives or friends. Um, and I realize in doing it, it is by its essential nature intergenerational. I mean, a lot of it is, of course, what happens is that you have spouses taking care of each other, and then as they get older, you have their adult kids taking care of them. Um, but it's as an enterprise, it evokes all sorts of things about the generations as you're caring for each other and dealing with those challenges. So, um, so that's what I find kind of exciting is that it's like, oh, wait a minute, this explodes the issue. It's not like just okay, how do you take care of older people? It's what are these relationships about? You know,
Right,
what are we learning from one another, as you just pointed out?
right.
um, this whole notion of it could be mentoring, it just could be, just engaging with one another and just over time in ways that are naturally cut off, or just, I wouldn't say naturally, but basically structurally cut off by the way our society is set up, which you can reinstitute these relationships. And one of the things that I think we're a ways from, but I think people are exploring are these multi generational communities, um, as well as communities that are based on interest. So, I remember you wrote this very interesting article called "The Hive," and so this, could be multi generational, but it could also go back to what we were talking about before. Is as we get older, this continued search for community and maintaining community.
Yeah, not only, yeah, the search and the necessity for, and so the openness to alternative lifestyles, I was listening to a talk yesterday by a coach, and she was talking about living with two women,
Mm-hmm.
and she was in her 60s, which, is a nice age to do that. I mean, as what is unfinished? Okay, so there are people who've been living alone for a long time. What's unfinished for them is living with a partner. But what kind of a partner? If I'm a woman, where do I find a man? If I'm a man, where do I find, my mate? That kind of thing. And it's not about necessarily mate. Mate is good for a number of decades, but it is not a necessity. What we need is to be able to be more creative and open about how then shall we live? What would make the most sense? Are there other single women? Are there college students living in the area that need a place to live while you, as a 79-year-old person, has empty bedrooms in your house? I mean,
Right.
all those kinds of creative thinking. So the silos, we've inherited from
Mm,
years of thinking in silos, but I think our generation um, certainly has had the experience of thinking outside the box.
mm,
And I think we could, as leaders in communities, encourage people to think outside the box.
right.
That creativity and curiosity are like antidotes for anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
And anxiety does increase as people get older.
Mm.
And then there's a fringe number that, feel more calm and settled, but it's really not, somebody said recently, they haven't told us the truth about aging. They haven't told us how anxious we'll become or
Mm.
how vulnerable we'll feel. And what are the antidotes to anxiety and vulnerability? But definitely companionship, but it doesn't necessarily mean mate
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I think too, in addition to um, maintaining relationships and being in relationship with your community and with your friends, and um, you talk a lot about again going back to potential and possibility, and I think in one of your six components you talk about the growth mindset, and so I had a recent show about with these two guys that I didn't know them in college, but they were actually, in my college at the same time, and we came to parallel paths, 50 years later, but they wrote a book called um, The Aging Wisely Project, and uh, and we talked a lot in a recent podcast about what you just mentioned, which is the growth mindset. So I think that that's what keeps you alive as you get older is not letting go of that, and you're not the same. You're not gonna probably start a huge business, but you might.
Mm,
Um, but
yes.
it is that sense that I can keep growing, not just plateauing. You know.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things that we could be a little bit more specific about commitment.
Mm-hmm.
Or it's, I could be committed to staying engaged. In other words, engaged, knowing what's going on in the world, um, having a place to process what's going on. So it's not just staying engaged, meaning I read um, I read the selected news that comes to my
Mm-hmm.
particular device. No, but it's also staying engaged in talking to people who think and feel differently. That's important. It takes courage to do that. It takes willingness to leave a comfort zone. It takes willingness to risk
Mm-hmm.
and possibly not to succeed.
Mm-hmm.
But there's some qualities that as we grow older we can cultivate so that we don't get stale and we don't just do the same thing every day and we don't just, you know, fall into irrelevance.
Mm-hmm.
I always think my three favorite words, relevance, belonging, and meaning, or relevance, meaning, and belonging,
Mm-hmm.
those are so essential as we get older.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes we don't know what's meaningful unless we talk to somebody else who said, wow, I never thought of it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So I have to offer can be meaningful. It's part of who we are, but it's also in the sharing that it becomes meaningful. It's also in the sharing that we have a sense of relevance,
Mm-hmm.
which is so important.
Yeah, yeah. We have a few minutes left, but before we do, I just wanted to make sure that I let our listeners and viewers know if they want to find out more about your work. Well, first of all, if you go on my Roel Resources website and go on the 45 Forward tab, you can just search for your previous shows. You have two previous shows, and one of them talked quite a bit about I liked your series of called Relieflets. You're providing guidance through times of turmoil and patience and possibility insights. But so, where can people find out more about your work?
Two places.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, One place is Lucid Learning Systems, which is my archival listing of
Mm-hmm.
um, certain kinds of programs and maybe some little blogs and articles associated with that. So that's one place that lucid learning is a kind of compendium of my
Mm-hmm.
work as a
Okay.
psychologist. The other, which is certainly something that I love doing, is I do with my partner, Barbara Peters.
Mm-hmm.
And her word of the year, by the way, was flow.
Hello.
And
Okay.
I really loved flow, but she took it. And so in thinking about it, I came up with sort of like a little bit the opposite of flow, which is potential and exercising that
Okay.
potential. Um, Now, what did you ask me again? Oh, where else? So Boom Talk Media,
Yeah.
just like that. Um, all one word, boomtalkmedia.com.
Mm-hmm.
And there you'll find probably years and years of podcasts
Okay.
with all kinds of people who have something interesting to say. And also the blogs and the books are there. So that's a great resource.
Mm-hmm.
There's also resource in my Facebook page for lucid learning, which is called Enlightened Information for Transformation,
Okay.
another place. And then, of course, there's Instagram for Boom Talk Media, where we have just kind of little pieces, little juicy bits uh,
Mm-hmm.
of some of the directions that we are fascinated by.
Right. Right. One of the things you've talked about too is moving forward in terms of, you know, um, patience and possibility, but also and perhaps unfinished business. But this notion that you're working on now of sort of helping people picking up the pieces and moving
Oh,
forward,
good.
which I think we find ourselves in that part of life. Talk about
Yes,
that a bit.
yes. Oh, thank you for asking. So, picking up the pieces and moving on is what we've come to name an online course,
Hmm.
truly for people of any age, but we did focus it on women over 50 and men. I'm sorry, that wasn't focused just on women. It was on people over 50. Picking up the pieces and moving on was a title that came as a result of thinking what people need, and certainly my experience as a psychologist is when somebody calls me initially, it's usually because something has changed. Something has changed for the better, something has changed for the more difficult, something has changed for the strangeness of it and the whole new territory that it is, any life disruption or interruption. That's when people have to stop, see who they are, begin to identify what they've got going, not
Mm-hmm.
only what they've lost, although letting go obviously is a part of it, but how. How do we put pieces together while we are working, walking on the stepping stones on our way to perhaps a more stable period of time or a more fruitful period of time or a safer period of time, whatever it is. So, picking up the pieces and moving on is our online course, which is going to be released this spring,
Okay.
in 2025.
Mm-hmm.
It is really a compilation of a lot of my work on change,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
going through the lifespan changing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we keep changing. It's I think, yeah, I do feel there are moments I like, okay, this stop for a little while, stabilize it before we try to pick up the pieces. But
But
I think that,
it is microscopic.
hmm
I mean, because we talk about change. That's a you know small word for a very, very big process.
yeah, yeah,
But we need to get down to the nitty-gritty on it.
right, yeah. And there are, well, one of the things I liked about your Patience and Possibility series is just the recognition that even though there's a sense of urgency, especially as we get older, that it is important to pause, and that to really to to let things clarify through patience. You're not going to think sometimes what does move as fast as it's going to move fast. That's just it's not going to move any faster because you want it to.
Right.
So take that time to really refocus and settle. And I guess there are ways to do it also. I mean, through certain practices, and
Sure.
they can be as formal as meditation, but then they can just be forcing yourself to slow down when it
Yeah.
seems antithetical to.
And yeah, and there's some really good, there's some really interesting changes in the way we breathe, in the way we move, that the body needs to come back into the equation so that we're not forcing ourselves, but
Hmm.
we're allowing ourselves. And do I have time to say one more
Sure,
suggestion?
we have plenty of time. 5 minutes. We've got time.
Okay, that's plenty of time. So, what I remember about you has always been your interest in creating guides.
Hmm.
That is a bigger interest than aging is the more generic impulse that you have, that I always believe you've had. It's part of your internal setup.
Hmm.
You can create guides. yes, it's guides to aging. Yes, it's guides to caregiving, but you have in you a lot of other guides as well that may not turn out to be big books. They
Right.
may turn out to be smaller or different format, but they will be guides.
Mm-hmm.
And which is, the ability to see things that other people don't see, the ability to identify what other people might not identify as a pivot point or as a guide post or signal or sign. I identify with this with you also being a pathfinder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so I had the Indian name Possibilities Pathfinder,
Oh,
but you are a Pathfinder as well. And so I just wanted to bring that forward
right. Mm.
as part of for your audience to know.
Well, thank you for that. That's a good observation. You're right. I mean, I think that that's something that um, uh, compels me. Um, it feels like that's who I am. I'm not a do this, do that, but this is the way you need to do things. But people are stuck often, including myself, and they just need a hand. They need like here are some thoughts to help you move forward. You have to be the agent of this change, but here's some help. Here's some ways you can think about it to
Ways.
get yourself unstuck. Right, ways. That was our
Right.
working title. Ways. Yeah,
Right. And who
yeah,
knows, maybe that still remains to be, the ultimate guidebook to ways of doing things regardless of age.
yeah, yeah,
You know.
yeah. I think that's really critical. So, well, we did our conversation. I really enjoyed it. It's always great. I do feel that when we connect, it's like, okay, we we're still on the same conversation. We not the same conversation, but we're still in conversation. We're still exploring. It's not like, okay, well, where are you now?
Right,
I know where you are. Um, besides physically in Arizona. So I
right.
just want to, thank you for another great conversation. I'm sure we'll have more going forward. Um, uh, Again, folks, we've been talking with Dr. Andrea Gould Marks about uh, a whole range of issues of change and possibility and resilience. Um, Now, I just want to let you know that we'll be revisiting my podcast next week on 45 Forward. And I'll be talking with Judy Grimaldi, who is a pioneering New York elder law attorney who will not only reflect on her career as she recently retired, but about literally what we need to do to think about things in terms of our planning for the future. Um, but also, she's has been involved in helping to start a state-of-the-art senior center, which has some very interesting, enriching programs. So join me next week on 45 Forward. Until then, folks, keep moving forward.